The paw prints told a story that Michael Thompson couldn't ignore, not after 20 years of living on the edge of Montana's wilderness. Each depression in the fresh snow led closer to his farmhouse, a path no wild predator should ever willingly take. But it was what lay at the end of that trail, collapsed on his porch in the bitter cold of a Montana December, that would forever alter the course of his solitary life at Pine Hollow Farm. The mercury had plunged to 15 below that night, the kind of cold that steals your breath and freezes your eyelashes. Mike had been checking the generator when he first heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, a whimpering cry, desperate and fading, unlike anything he'd heard in all his years on the land. What waited beyond his door would require a choice. Follow the rules every rural Montana resident knew by heart about wild predators, or follow his conscience into uncharted territory. Little did he know, the animal dying on his doorstep would not only heal his wounded heart, but would one day return with a gift so profound it would move him to tears. The black shape sprawled across the weathered boards of Mike's porch barely resembled a wolf anymore. Blood matted the creature's midnight fur, steam rising from its body as the warmth of life fought against the killing cold. Mike stood frozen in the doorway, his breath catching at the sight of the young wolf's labored breathing. Its eyes, amber and intelligent, followed Mike's movements with a desperate intensity that pierced straight through his practiced caution. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, his words crystallizing in the frigid air. The animal couldn't have been more than a year old, still gangly with youth despite its powerful frame. A deep gash ran along its side, the blood now frozen in crimson rivulets against black fur. One of its back legs lay at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Most alarming was the metal trap still clamped around its front paw. Illegal in these parts for over a decade. Someone had set it anyway, and this young wolf had dragged itself, trap and all, over 2 miles of rugged terrain in sub-zero temperatures to the only place with lights shining in the darkness. Mike scanned the tree line nervously. Wolves never traveled alone. Where there was one, there should be others. A pack. But the night remained silent, save for the whistle of wind through the pines and the wolf's increasingly labored breathing. This was wrong. Everything about this scenario defied natural order. Wolves feared humans. They didn't seek them out in times of desperation. For 3 years since Sarah's death, Mike had lived alone on Pine Hollow Farm, the silence broken only by the occasional visit from Martha next door or the seasonal workers he hired for harvest. The solitude had become both his comfort and his prison. Now, staring at the dying wolf on his porch, something long dormant stirred within him, a sense of purpose he'd thought buried alongside his wife. "Don't move," he said softly to the wolf, though whether for the animal's benefit or his own, he couldn't say. Just don't move. 20 years of working the land had taught Mike Thompson more about wildlife than most game wardens. Pine Hollow Farm sat on the edge of wolf territory, and over the years he'd developed an uneasy coexistence with the predators. Unlike some of his neighbors who shot at any wolf that dared cross their property lines, Mike had always taken a different approach. He kept his sheep in protected enclosures, used guard dogs, and accepted the occasional loss as the price of living alongside nature rather than against it. His late wife Sarah had been the real wildlife enthusiast, though. A veterinary technician with a special interest in predator species, she'd volunteered at the Evergreen Wildlife Rehabilitation Center every weekend for 15 years. Through her, Mike had learned to identify wolf pack territories, to recognize individual animals by their markings, and to understand the complex social structures that governed their behavior. After Sarah's passing from cancer 3 years ago, Mike had stopped visiting the center, but he still maintained his subscription to wolf conservation newsletters, still kept the wildlife reference books on his shelves. It was Sarah's passion living on in the only way he could still hold on to her. As he watched the wolf struggle for breath on his porch, Mike felt decades of accumulated knowledge rush to the forefront of his mind. This was a young male, likely on the cusp of leaving his birth pack to seek his own territory. A dangerous time for wolves, even without human interference. The trap suggested he'd wandered too close to someone's property, someone who didn't share Mike's philosophy about coexistence. Mike knew what he should do. Call Officer Jenkins from Wildlife Services and let the professionals handle it. That was protocol, that was sensible, that was safe. But he also knew something else. By the time help arrived from town, this wolf would be dead. Mike's hand hovered over his phone, Officer Jenkins' number ready to dial. The logical part of his brain recited the warnings like a familiar prayer. Wolves are wild animals. They can carry rabies. They're unpredictable when injured. They're apex predators designed to kill. Yet something else entirely was happening in his heart as he watched the labored rise and fall of the wolf's chest, the increasingly desperate look in those intelligent amber eyes. This animal had sought human help, had dragged itself miles. With a trap tearing at its flesh, had chosen Mike's farmhouse among all the possible destinations in these woods. Sarah would know what to do, he murmured to the empty kitchen behind him. And then, as though his wife had whispered in his ear, he knew exactly what Sarah would have done. The realization settled over him with absolute certainty. The phone clattered back onto the counter. Mike moved with sudden purpose, gathering supplies, his thickest leather work gloves, a muzzle from Sarah's old vet kit, wire cutters for the trap, blankets, and the emergency medical kit he kept for the farm. Animals. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, even as his mind raced with doubts. Every rural Montana child was raised with stories about wolves, both the romantic myths about noble wild spirits and the darker warnings about vicious killers. Somewhere between those extremes lay the truth, and Mike had spent enough time in these mountains to know that the reality of wolves was far more complex than either extreme. What he was about to do went against every safety protocol. If his neighbors knew, they'd call him reckless, foolish, maybe even dangerous. If that trap had been set legally on someone's property, he could be interfering with their legal right to protect their livestock. If the wolf had rabies, Mike would be exposing himself to the deadly virus. And yet... He looked again at the wolf, meeting those amber eyes that seemed to hold a wisdom and desperation that transcended species. In that moment, the choice crystallized with perfect clarity. "Hang on, buddy," Mike said quietly, as he pulled on the thick gloves. "This isn't going to feel good for either of us." The moment Mike stepped onto the porch, the wolf's body tensed. Despite its grievous injuries, it managed to raise its head, a low, warning growl rumbling from deep in its chest. Mike froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was madness. He was about to touch a wild predator with his bare hands, with nothing but leather gloves between his skin and teeth designed to tear flesh from bone. "Easy," Mike said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Easy now." He crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. The wolf's eyes never left his face, tracking his every movement with primal intensity. Mike began talking, a continuous stream of gentle words, the content less important than the soothing cadence. "I know you're hurting, I know you're scared, but that trap's going to kill you if we don't get it off. I'm not going to hurt you. You came to me, remember? Something brought you here, to this house, to my door." The growl subsided, replaced by rapid, shallow panting. Taking this as the only invitation he was likely to get, Mike inched forward. The wolf watched, muscles tense but making no move to attack. With trembling hands, Mike managed to slip the muzzle over the wolf's snout, a necessary precaution that felt like a betrayal of the fragile trust forming between them. The trap was brutal, an old-fashioned steel-jaw design with rusty teeth that had nearly severed the wolf's paw. Blood had frozen around the metal, creating a macabre sculpture of suffering. Working quickly, Mike positioned the wire cutters and snapped through the trap's spring mechanism. The wolf flinched, but made no sound as Mike carefully removed the device from its mangled limb. "There," Mike whispered, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "First step done." Now came the truly dangerous part. He needed to move the injured animal inside, where he could assess the damage properly and try to stabilize it until morning. The wolf was easily 80 pounds, manageable under normal circumstances, but a logistical nightmare when the cargo was a wounded predator. Mike slid his arms beneath the wolf's body as gently as possible, feeling the heat of fever radiating through the matted fur. The animal went rigid at his touch, but did not struggle. Whether from trust or simply the extremity of its injuries, Mike couldn't tell. "I've got you," he murmured. "I've got you now." As Mike lifted the wolf from the blood-stained porch, something shifted between them. An invisible line crossed that could never be uncrossed. In that moment, this was no longer just a wild animal he was trying to save. In his mind, the wolf already had a name. "Shadow," Mike said softly. "I'm going to call you Shadow." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With that simple act of naming, Mike sealed his commitment. Whatever happened next, their fates were now intertwined. The next 72 hours tested the limits of Mike's endurance and resolve. He converted his mudroom into a makeshift medical ward, using Sarah's old veterinary manuals as guides for the emergency care of a critically injured wild predator. The wolf, Shadow, drifted in and out of consciousness, his powerful body racked with fever as infection from the trap wound took hold. Mike worked through that first night without rest, cleaning the mangled paw with antiseptic, setting the broken leg as best he could with makeshift splints, and administering the antibiotics he kept on hand for his livestock. When the medical supplies ran low, he called Dr. Rachel Winters at the local vet clinic, an old friend of Sarah's. "I need supplies for a large dog with severe lacerations and a broken leg," he said, the careful omission hanging in the air between them. "Mike," Rachel's voice came through wary but concerned, "what kind of large dog are we talking about?" The pause stretched between them, filled with the weight of what he couldn't say. "The kind I can't bring in," he finally answered. Rachel's sigh crackled over the line. "I'll have a package ready for Martha to pick up, no questions asked. But Mike, be careful. Whatever you're doing, just be careful." Martha Wilson, his 70-year-old neighbor and the closest thing to family he had left, arrived that afternoon with the medical supplies and a stern look that melted the moment she saw Shadow lying on the blankets, fighting for his life. "Oh, Mike," she whispered, "what have you gotten yourself into?" "I couldn't leave him to die, Martha." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded once. Sarah would be proud. Foolish, but proud. Together, they established a round-the-clock watch. The wolf's condition worsened before it improved, his temperature spiking dangerously high on the second night. Mike sat beside him, applying cool compresses and talking continuously, his voice hoarse from the constant stream of one-sided conversation. "You're stronger than this," he told Shadow, as the wolf's breathing grew increasingly labored. "You survived. That trap, you made it all the way here. Don't give up now." By the dawn of the third day, Mike had gone nearly 70 hours without proper sleep. He dozed in short bursts beside the wolf, jerking awake at every change in Shadow's breathing pattern. Martha forced him to eat, pushing bowls of stew into his hands and standing over him until he finished. "You can't help him if you collapse," she said firmly. The infection was the greatest enemy, spreading from the mangled paw up the leg. The antibiotics seemed to hold it at bay, but just barely. The breaking point came on the evening of the third day, when Shadow stopped responding to Mike's voice altogether, his body limp and burning with fever. "We need real help," Martha said, watching Mike's face crumple with exhaustion and defeat. "This is beyond us now." Mike knew she was right. His desperate measures had bought the wolf time, but Shadow needed professional care to survive. This decision to reach out meant potential legal consequences: interference with wildlife, possession of a protected predator species, perhaps even charges related to the illegal trap if authorities believed it was his. With trembling hands, Mike dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. "Evergreen Wildlife Rehabilitation Center," answered a familiar voice. "David," Mike said, his voice breaking. "It's Mike Thompson. I need help. It's about a wolf." Dawn broke on the 4th day, with pale golden light filtering through the mudroom windows. Mike had finally succumbed to exhaustion, slumped against the wall beside Shadow's makeshift bed. Dr. David Carter from the Wildlife Center had worked through most of the night, properly cleaning and treating the wolf's wounds, administering IV antibiotics and fluids, and replacing Mike's amateur splint with a proper cast. "He's young and strong," David had said before departing in the early morning hours. "That's in his favor. But Mike, you need to prepare yourself. Wild animals this severely injured often don't make it, even with the best care." Now, in the quiet of morning, Mike stirred awake, his body stiff and aching from the uncomfortable position. He blinked, disoriented for a moment, until his eyes fell on Shadow. The wolf lay still, his breathing steadier than it had been since his arrival. Mike held his breath, afraid to hope. Then Shadow's eyes opened. Not the glazed, unfocused gaze of fever, but clear, alert amber eyes that fixed directly on Mike's face. For several heartbeats, they simply looked at each other, human and wolf, connected by something neither could name. Shadow's tail moved. Slightly, not quite a wag, but a deliberate movement that acknowledged Mike's presence. "Hey there," Mike whispered, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "Welcome back." Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of Mike's voice, then relaxed. The wolf made a soft huffing sound that wasn't quite a growl, more a greeting than a warning. Mike reached out slowly, giving Shadow every chance to object. When no growl came, he gently placed his hand on the wolf's head, feeling the coarse fur beneath his fingers. Shadow didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned slightly into the touch. Martha found them like that an hour later when she arrived with breakfast. She stopped in the doorway, breakfast tray in hand, her eyes widening at the sight of Mike sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading aloud from one of Sarah's old nature books, while the wolf listened with apparent interest. "Well," she said softly, "I'll be damned." Mike looked up, a smile breaking across his exhausted face. "He's going to make it, Martha. He's really going to make it." As winter deepened outside, something remarkable began to unfold within the walls of Pine Hollow farmhouse. Shadow's physical recovery progressed steadily under the combined care of Mike, Martha, and regular visits from Dr. Carter. But it was the relationship developing between man and wolf that left everyone witnessing it in a state of amazed disbelief. Dr. Carter documented everything with scientific precision, partly for Shadow's medical record, partly out of professional fascination. "I've rehabilitated 12 wolves over my career," he told Mike during one of his visits. "Never, not once, have I seen behavior like this." What made their connection extraordinary wasn't just Shadow's surprising tolerance of human presence. It was the apparent understanding that seemed to pass between them. Shadow responded to Mike's voice in ways that defied explanation, recognizing not just tone, but specific words and phrases. When Mike said, medicine time, Shadow would reluctantly allow his wounds to be treated. When Mike asked, "Are you hungry?" the wolf's ears would perk up immediately. Most remarkable was Shadow's protective behavior. When strangers visited the farm, the wolf would position himself between them and Mike, not aggressively, but watchfully. When Mike had a coughing fit one evening, the result of a cold caught during one of the bitter nights, Shadow had paced anxiously beside him, not settling until Mike's breathing returned to normal. "It's like he knows I saved him," Mike told Martha one evening as they watched Shadow sleeping peacefully by the fireplace, his injured legs stretched out toward the warmth. "Like he's returning the favor." Martha, who had initially been the most skeptical, nodded thoughtfully. "Sarah always said animals understand more than we give them credit for." Dr. Carter brought Officer Jenkins from Wildlife Services to the farm in late January, when Shadow's condition had stabilized enough to discuss long-term plans. The officer was initially furious at Mike's actions, reciting regulations and potential penalties in a tense conversation that seemed headed toward legal consequences. Then Shadow limped into the room. The wolf assessed the situation, sensing the tension in the air. Rather than retreating, as a wild animal should in the presence of a stranger, Shadow moved to Mike's side and sat calmly beside his chair. When Mike placed a reassuring hand on Shadow's head, the wolf leaned into the touch. Officer Jenkins fell silent mid-sentence, his trained expressions of authority melting into stunned disbelief. "In 20 years on this job," he finally said, "I've never seen anything like that." By the end of the visit, the legal discussion had transformed into something else entirely. A conversation about rehabilitation protocols, release timing, and the possibility that this case might warrant special consideration. "What's happening here isn't in any of our manuals," Officer Jenkins admitted as he prepared to leave. "We need to think carefully about what's best for this particular animal." As January turned to February, the unique nature of their bond became impossible to ignore. Shadow seemed to anticipate Mike's needs, bringing him gloves he'd left in another room, alerting him to vehicles approaching the farm long before they were visible, even herding the chickens back to their coop one evening when they'd escaped. Their enclosure, "It's like he's trying to earn his keep," Mike told Dr. Carter during one of his regular visits. "Like he understands this is a working farm and wants to contribute." At night, when the temperature plunged and the old farmhouse creaked against the wind, Shadow slept on the floor beside Mike's bed. Sometimes Mike would wake to find the wolf watching him in the darkness, amber eyes reflecting the faint moonlight, filtering through the curtains. "What are you thinking behind those eyes?" Mike would whisper. "What do you see when you look at me?" In those quiet moments, the barrier between human and wild animal seemed to thin, revealing something ancient and profound, a connection that predated civilization itself, reaching back to the first times humans and wolves had found common purpose in the unforgiving wilderness. As February melted into March, Shadow's physical transformation was remarkable to witness. The mangled paw had healed better than anyone expected, though he would always carry a slight limp, a permanent reminder of his brush with death. His broken leg had mended, the cast recently removed to reveal a limb that was functional, if not quite as strong as before. His midnight fur had regained its glossy sheen, and he had filled out to a healthy 90 pounds of lean muscle. But it was the inner transformation that proved most fascinating. Shadow was neither fully wild nor fully domesticated. He existed in a unique middle ground that challenged everything Mike thought he knew about wolves. Dr. Carter brought a wildlife behaviorist to observe Shadow, a serious-faced woman who took copious notes and asked endless questions about his daily routines. Her conclusion both validated what Mike had suspected and complicated the path forward. "He's displaying a remarkable adaptation," she explained. "He's maintained core wolf behaviors while simultaneously developing unprecedented levels of cross-species." Social intelligence, simply put, he understands you're not a wolf, but he's accepted you as something like pack. The implications were both heartwarming and troubling. Shadow's ability to adapt was a testament to his intelligence, but it also raised difficult questions about his future. A wolf, too comfortable with humans, might not survive in the wild, might even be dangerous if he approached the wrong people expecting the kindness he'd found at Pine Hollow Farm. With spring approaching, Mike began working with Dr. Carter to develop rehabilitation exercises designed to maintain Shadow's wild instincts. They created scent trails around the property, hiding food that Shadow had to track and hunt. They minimized human contact to just Mike and the essential medical personnel. They constructed situations that required problem-solving and self-reliance. Shadow took to these challenges with remarkable enthusiasm, seeming to understand on some level that these were not just games, but preparation for something important. He would disappear into the woods surrounding the farm for hours at a time, returning with evidence of successful hunting, confirmation that his predatory skills remained intact despite his injuries. On a warm April afternoon, Mike sat on the porch watching Shadow navigate an obstacle course they'd constructed to strengthen his healing limbs. Martha joined him, passing him a mug of coffee as she settled into the adjacent rocking chair. "You know you have to let him go eventually," she said quietly. Mike kept his eyes on Shadow, who had just successfully leapt over a fallen log. "I know, but I'm worried." Mike turned to look at her, the fear plain on his face. What if he approaches hunters? What if he can't hunt well enough with that paw? What if his pack won't accept him back? Martha's weathered hand covered his. "Those are all good questions. But here's another one. What happens to a wild thing when you keep it from being wild?" Mike had no answer for that. He knew she was right. Keeping Shadow confined to the farm would be a kind of prison, no matter how loving. Wolves needed vast territories, needed the complex social structure of their packs, needed the freedom to be what they were born to be. Yet the thought of releasing Shadow filled Mike with a dread that kept him awake at night. It wasn't just fear for the wolf's safety, though that was certainly part of it. It was also the knowledge that Shadow had become more than just a rehabilitation project. In the months since that desperate night on the porch, the wolf had somehow filled a void in Mike's life that had been empty since Sarah's death. Shadow had given him purpose again. Shadow had brought people back into his life: Dr. Carter, Officer Jenkins, the wildlife specialists. Even Martha visited more often now. The solitude that had been both comfort and prison was broken, replaced by a new rhythm of life centered around this extraordinary animal. "I don't know if I can do it," Mike admitted, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to let him go." Martha squeezed his hand. "Sarah would say that sometimes the greatest love means letting go." Mike nodded, blinking back the sudden moisture in his eyes. Sarah always was the wisest of us. Ooh, as if sensing the emotional current passing between the humans, Shadow abandoned his exercises and trotted to the porch, resting his massive head on Mike's knee. Mike stroked the coarse fur, meeting those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand far more than should be possible. "You deserve to be free," Mike told him softly, "no matter how much I'll miss you." By May, the transformation was complete. The desperate, dying creature that had collapsed on Mike's porch 5 months earlier had become a magnificent animal in his prime. Shadow moved through the woods surrounding Pine Hollow Farm with the fluid grace of his species, his powerful body having overcome the limitations of his healed injuries. Only the faintest limp remained, visible only to those who knew to look for it. The changes in Mike were equally profound, if less immediately visible. The grief that had hollowed him out after Sarah's death had not disappeared, that would never truly happen, but it had shifted. making space for something new. Purpose had returned to his days. The heavy silence of the farmhouse had been replaced by conversation, planning, and the companionable presence of the wolf who had, against all odds, unchosen him. Dr. Carter captured the physical changes in Shadow through a series of photographs that he spread across Mike's kitchen table during one of his final evaluation visits. "Look at this progression," he said, pointing to images that spanned from December to May, from near death to peak condition. "Honestly, Mike, I've never seen a rehabilitation this successful, especially with such severe initial injuries." The earliest photos showed a skeletal creature with dull fur and glazed eyes. The most recent revealed a powerful predator with alert ears and watchful gaze, every inch the apex hunter his ancestors had been for millennia. His weight is ideal, his blood work is perfect, his healed injuries are strong enough for the wild. Dr. Carter continued, his tone shifting from clinical to something more hesitant. "Medically speaking, he's ready for release." Mike nodded, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. "And behaviorally?" This was the more complicated question. Dr. Carter had brought in specialists throughout Shadow's rehabilitation, all of whom had marveled at the wolf's unusual relationship with Mike, while expressing concerns about what it might mean for his survival in the wild. "That's harder to answer," Dr. Carter admitted. "He's maintained his hunting instincts, which is crucial. His responses to other humans remain appropriately cautious. His physical capabilities are suitable for survival." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The unprecedented factor is his bond with you. There's simply no research on how a relationship like this might affect a wolf's reintegration into the wild." What neither of them said aloud was the fear that lived in the back of Mike's mind. What if Shadow sought out humans after his release, expecting the same treatment he'd received at Pine Hollow Farm? What if that trust led him to a farmer with a rifle instead of a rescuer with bandages? That evening, after Dr. Carter had gone, Mike stood at the edge of the woods, watching Shadow track a rabbit through the underbrush. The wolf moved with perfect stealth, every muscle coordinated in the ancient dance of predator and prey. There was nothing domestic in that movement, nothing that spoke of captivity or dependence. Yet when Shadow successfully caught his quarry and looked back toward Mike, pride evident in his posture, the connection between them was undeniable. Not master and pet, nor even caretaker and patient, but something far more complex, a relationship with no name in the human vocabulary. The next morning, Mike made the call he'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "It's time," he told Officer Jenkins. "Shadow's ready for release." June arrived with warming days and fields erupting in wildflowers. The release date was set for the summer solstice, June 21st, when the extended daylight would give Shadow the best possible start in his return to the wild. The location had been carefully chosen, a remote area of Silver Ridge, known to be the territory of the wolf pack that Shadow had likely come from originally. Officer Jenkins had tracked the pack's movements using radio collar data from one of the older females. "They're stable, 6 members strong, and they've accepted new wolves before," he assured Mike. "If Shadow is going to find a pack to join, these are his best odds." With the date approaching, a strange tension filled Pine Hollow Farm. Mike found himself cataloging lasts with painful awareness. The last time he'd watched Shadow chase rabbits across the east field, the last sunset they'd observed together. From the porch, the last night the wolf would sleep beside his bed. He tried to hide his growing sadness from Shadow, but the wolf's sensitivity to his moods made this impossible. When Mike's emotions became too heavy, Shadow would press against his leg or rest his head on Mike's knee, gestures that somehow managed to both ease the pain and intensify it. 3 days before the scheduled release, Martha arrived with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Sarah would want you to have this now," she said, placing it in his hands. Inside was a journal bound in soft leather, the pages filled with Sarah's neat handwriting. It was her wildlife observation journal, the one she'd kept throughout their marriage, documenting every notable animal encounter over 2 decades. "I found it when I was cleaning out those old boxes you gave me after she passed," Martha explained. "Never seemed the right time to give it to you before. Now it does." That night, after Shadow had fallen asleep, Mike read Sarah's journal by lamplight. Her voice came alive on the pages, her passion for wildlife leaping from each careful observation and thoughtful reflection. Near the end, in an entry dated just months before her diagnosis, he found a passage that made his breath catch. "Watch the Silver Ridge pack from the North Ridge today. The alpha female injured her leg last month, but she's healing well. What fascinates me is how the pack adjusted, bringing her food, giving her time to rest, protecting her until she could hunt again. We call them wild, but there's wisdom in their care for each other that we could learn from. Maybe the line between wild and domestic isn't as clear as we pretend. Maybe it's love, not tameness, that truly connects all living things." Mike closed the journal, Sarah's words echoing in his mind. For the first time since the release date had been set, he felt something shift inside him. Not an absence of grief, but the presence of something stronger. A certainty that what he was doing, painful as it was, honored both Shadow's nature and the love that had brought them together. The next morning, Mike woke to find Shadow watching him. Those amber eyes somber, as if the wolf somehow understood what was coming. Mike patted the bed beside him, breaking the no-furniture rule he'd maintained throughout Shadow's rehabilitation. The wolf hesitated only a moment before jumping up, his warm weight settling against Mike's side. "You're going home soon," Mike told him, running his fingers through the thick fur. "Back to where you belong." Shadow sighed, a deeply human sound that seemed to contain all the complexity of their situation. They stayed like that until the sun rose high enough to bathe the room in golden light, neither willing to break this moment of connection before the approaching separation. The morning of the solstice arrived with perfect clarity. The Montana sky stretching endless blue above the pine-covered mountains. The release team had gathered at Pine Hollow Farm at dawn. Officer Jenkins, Dr. Carter, a wildlife biologist with tracking equipment, and Martha, who had insisted on being present to make sure you actually go through with it. The transport carrier waited in the back of Officer Jenkins' truck, its door currently open as they prepared for the difficult task of convincing Shadow to enter it. The wolf had been watching the preparations with evident wariness, staying closer to Mike than usual, sensing the tension in the air. The moment Mike picked up the special collar they would use to track Shadow's initial movements in the wild, the wolf seemed to understand what was happening. He backed away, amber eyes fixed on Mike with an intensity that made everyone fall silent. "He knows," Martha whispered. Mike nodded, his throat too tight for words. Kneeling down to Shadow's level, he held out the collar, letting the wolf inspect it. Shadow sniffed it cautiously, then looked up at Mike with what could only be described as resignation. "This is just temporary," Mike explained, his voice rough with emotion. "Just so we can make sure you're safe at first." Whether Shadow understood the words or merely the intention behind them, he stood perfectly still as Mike fastened the collar around his neck. When Mike's fingers lingered, stroking the soft fur beneath the wolf's chin, Shadow pressed his head into Mike's palm in a gesture that brought tears to every watching eye. The drive to the release site took nearly 3 hours, winding up mountain roads far from human habitation. Shadow remained surprisingly calm in his carrier, his eyes rarely leaving Mike, who rode in the back with him. The silence in the truck was heavy with unspoken emotions. Even Officer Jenkins, usually full of procedural reminders and regulations, remaining respectfully quiet. When they finally reached the small clearing that would serve as the release point, the team moved with quiet efficiency. Tracking equipment was checked, final medical observations recorded, release protocols reviewed. Throughout it all, Mike stood by Shadow's carrier, speaking softly to the wolf inside. "We've tracked the resident pack to about 3 miles north," Officer Jenkins finally said. "Close enough that Shadow should be able to find them if he chooses to, far enough that we won't create an immediate confrontation." Mike nodded, unable to trust his voice. The moment stretched, no one willing to be the first to say it was time. Finally, Martha stepped forward, placing her hand on Mike's shoulder. "It's time, Mike. The longer we wait, the harder it gets." Taking a deep breath, Mike moved to position himself to open the carrier door. The team spread out behind him, giving Shadow plenty of space for his first moments of freedom. Mike's hands trembled as he reached for the latch, then steadied as he looked once more into those amber eyes that had become more familiar to him than his own reflection. "Be free," he whispered. "Be what you were, born to be." With one swift movement, he opened the door. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Shadow remained inside the carrier, his gaze fixed on Mike. Then, with deliberate dignity, the wolf emerged. Everyone had expected Shadow to bolt for the trees. That was the normal reaction of a rehabilitated predator upon release. Instead, he stood calmly beside the carrier, surveying his surroundings with alert interest. His nose worked the air, catching the complex tapestry of scents that made up this new territory. Then, Shadow did something that none of the experts had anticipated, and that Mike would remember until his dying day. The wolf turned to face him directly, their eyes meeting in silent communication. With deliberate movement, Shadow approached Mike, stopping just before him. The wildlife biologist gasped softly. Officer Jenkins reached instinctively for his tranquilizer gun before Dr. Carter gently pushed his hand down. "Wait," Dr. Carter murmured. "Just wait." Shadow rose slightly on his hind legs, not fully, but enough to place his front paws gently against Mike's chest. Face to face, wolf and man regarded each other in a moment of connection so profound that Martha later said it felt like witnessing something sacred. Shadow held the position for several seconds, his breath warm against Mike's face, his eyes conveying something beyond human language. Then, just as gently, he lowered himself back to all fours, turned, and with one last glance, over his shoulder, loped toward the forest. At the tree line, he paused, silhouetted against the dark pines. The sunlight caught his black fur, illuminating him for one perfect moment against the wilderness that was calling him home. Then, with the silent grace of his kind, Shadow disappeared into the forest. The clearing felt suddenly empty, as if all the oxygen had been sucked away with the wolf's departure. Mike stood motionless, tears streaming unchecked down his face. No one spoke. No one needed to. They had all witnessed something extraordinary, something that defied scientific explanation, yet felt profoundly true. "He'll be okay," Martha finally said, her own voice thick with emotion. "He's strong, he's smart, he'll find his way." Mike nodded, unable to form words around the ache in his chest. Officer Jenkins awkwardly patted his shoulder, murmuring something about tracking data and weekly updates. Dr. Carter busied himself with the equipment, giving Mike space to compose himself. As they packed up to leave, Mike took one last look at the forest that had swallowed Shadow. Somewhere in those trees, his friend was beginning his new life, the life he was always meant to live. The pain of separation was raw and real, but beneath it ran a current of something else. Pride. Pride that he had been part of returning this magnificent creature to the wilderness where he belonged. "Goodbye, Shadow," he whispered. "Be wild. Be free." Summer faded into autumn, the Montana landscape transforming in a blaze of gold and crimson before yielding to the first dusting of early snow. Life at Pine Hollow Farm settled into new rhythms. both familiar and strange. Mike found himself constantly turning at small sounds, half expecting to see Shadow padding through the kitchen or watching from the edge of the fields. The absence was a presence of its own, a shadow-shaped hole in the fabric of his days. The tracking collar had functioned as intended, sending regular data for the first 8 weeks after release. Officer Jenkins called every Friday with updates, his initially formal reports gradually warming into something more like friendly conversations. He's moving well, covering appropriate territory for a lone wolf. No signs of injury or distress, Jenkins reported in late July. He seems to be avoiding human settlements entirely, a good sign that he's maintained proper wild instincts. By August, the data suggested Shadow was trailing the Silver Ridge Pack, keeping a cautious distance while gradually moving closer to their territory. This is textbook behavior for a lone wolf seeking pack acceptance, the wildlife biologist explained during one conference call. He's demonstrating perfect instinctual behavior, exactly what we'd hoped to see. The collar's battery had been designed to last 3 months, its signal growing weaker through September before finally falling, silent in early October. The last data points placed Shadow firmly within the Silver Ridge Pack's territory, though whether he had been accepted remained unknown. No news is good news, Dr. Carter assured Mike during his final official visit to the farm. If he'd been injured or killed, we likely would have found evidence. The fact that we haven't found the collar suggests he's still wearing it, still moving through those mountains exactly as he should be. Life continued. The summer harvest was brought in. The first frost silvered the fields. Mike threw himself into farm projects that had been neglected during Shadow's rehabilitation, fixing the sagging north fence, repainting the barn, clearing brush from the creek bed. Physical labor helped fill the hours and exhaust him enough for sleep. Martha visited more frequently than before, bringing casseroles and news from town, sitting with him on the porch as the evenings grew chiller. Sometimes they talked about Shadow, sharing memories of his time at the farm. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, watching the mountains change colors as the sun set. "You did a good thing, Mike," she told him one evening in late October. "I don't just mean for that wolf, I mean for yourself too." Mike considered this, turning the thought over carefully. "He changed me," he finally said, "made me remember what it feels like to care that much about something." "Sarah would be proud," Martha said gently, "of both of you." As November arrived, with its shorter days and longer nights, Mike found himself spending more time with Sarah's wildlife journal, reading her observations about the changing seasons and the animals that had crossed their path over the years. Her final entry, written just weeks before her diagnosis, felt like a message across time. "Saw the most extraordinary thing today. A raven bringing gifts to the old woman who feeds them by the general store. Shiny things, pretty stones, even a lost earring once. People call it superstition, but I think it's something else. I think it's gratitude. Perhaps we underestimate how deeply other creatures can feel, how well they remember kindness. There are mysteries in these mountains that science hasn't named yet." Mike closed the journal, running his fingers over Sarah's handwriting. The pain of missing her had shifted over time, becoming less like an open wound and more like a tender scar, a permanent mark that told the story of love and loss. Shadow's departure had awakened that pain anew, but also reminded him that life continued, that new connections were possible even after devastating loss. As the first heavy snow of winter blanketed Pine Hollow Farm, Mike settled into the quiet rhythms of the season. The livestock needed extra care now, the generator required regular maintenance, and the long evenings gave him time to plan spring plantings. He thought of Shadow less constantly now, though the wolf still visited his dreams, running free through mountain meadows, strong and wild as he was meant to be. On particularly clear nights, Mike sometimes stood on the porch and listened to the distant howling of wolves echoing across the valley. He could never be sure if Shadow's voice was among them, but he liked to think it was. Liked to imagine his friend running with the pack, hunting beneath the winter moon, perhaps even raising pups of his own come spring. Life went on. The wolf was where he belonged, and Mike was beginning to believe that perhaps he was too. Part 13, The Unexpected Return. December arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow, locking Pine Hollow Farm in the quiet isolation of deep winter. The second anniversary of Sarah's death passed with less acute pain than the year before. Mike marked it by placing one of her favorite wildflowers, dried from his summer gathering, on the small memorial he'd built near the creek where they used to picnic. A week before Christmas, the worst blizzard in 20 years swept through the mountains, dumping nearly 3 feet of snow in 36 hours. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling windows and dropping temperatures to 30 below zero. Mike spent most of those 2 days tending to the livestock, keeping the generator running and stoking the wood stove to near glowing heat. On the morning after the storm, he woke before dawn to check the property for damage. The world outside was transformed, smooth white drifts obscuring familiar landmarks, trees bent beneath the weight of snow, an otherworldly silence cloaking everything. Mike pulled on his heaviest coat, lit a lantern against the pre-dawn darkness, and stepped onto the porch. The tracks stopped him cold. Wolf tracks, large ones, circled the farmhouse. Clear and distinct in the fresh snow, they told a story of careful investigation, approaching from the east woods, circling the barn, coming up to the porch steps before retreating back toward the tree line. Mike's heart hammered against his ribs as he lifted the lantern higher, following the trail with his eyes until it disappeared into the darkness. It could be any wolf, he told himself firmly. The storm would have pushed wildlife down from the higher elevations, seeking shelter in the relative protection of the foothills. Any number of wolves might have investigated his property out of hunger or curiosity. Yet, even as he thought it, Mike knew, those tracks were spaced with a slight irregularity, the faintest suggestion of a limp in the right front paw. Shadow had come home, or at least he had visited. The tracks clearly showed the wolf had not stayed, had not even attempted to approach the house beyond a brief investigation of the porch. This was not the behavior of a wolf seeking human contact, but rather one checking a remembered location before returning to the wild. Exactly as it should be, Mike thought, ignoring the hollow ache in his chest. Exactly right. He followed the tracks to where they disappeared into the tree line, searching the silent forest for any sign of movement. Nothing stirred in the pre-dawn stillness, except his own breath, fogging white in the bitter cold. "Be well out there," he whispered to the empty woods. For 3 days, Mike told no one about the tracks. He wasn't entirely sure why, perhaps afraid that speaking of it might somehow jinx whatever had brought Shadow back to the farm, perhaps unwilling to hear logical explanations about territorial behaviors or weather-driven migrations. Some experiences felt too personal to share, too sacred to dissect with scientific terminology. On the 4th day after the blizzard, Mike woke to find something on his porch that hadn't been there when he'd gone to bed. A perfect pine cone, larger than any he'd seen before, placed precisely in the center of the welcome mat. Mike stared at it for a long time, unmoving despite the cold seeping through his clothes. A pine cone. It could have fallen from the roof, could have been dropped by a squirrel, could be nothing more than coincidence. Except Mike knew, with a certainty that defied rational explanation, that it was none of those things. This was a deliberate placement, a gift. With trembling hands, he picked up the pine cone, turning it over in his palm. It was undamaged and unusually symmetrical, its scales folded in perfect geometric patterns. The kind of natural object that caught the eye with its beauty. The kind of thing Sarah would have collected on their walks, adding to her shelf of forest treasures. The kind of thing an intelligent creature might select as valuable. Fresh tracks in the new snowfall confirmed what his heart already knew. Shadow had returned in the night. This time the wolf had come all the way to the door, had left his offering, and had disappeared back into the forest before dawn. Mike brought the pine cone inside, placing it carefully on the mantel above the fireplace. Throughout that day, he found himself looking at it, touching it, as if it might somehow contain an explanation for this extraordinary development. That evening, he called Dr. Carter. "Is it possible?" he asked after explaining what had happened. "Could he be deliberately bringing me gifts?" The long pause on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "There's documented evidence of wild crows and ravens bringing gifts to humans who feed them," Dr. Carter finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "Some primates have been observed exchanging objects in what appears to be gift-giving behavior. But a wild wolf?" Another pause. "I've never heard of such a thing." "But is it impossible?" Mike pressed. "Science has been wrong before," Dr. Carter admitted, "especially about the cognitive and emotional capacities of animals. If you're asking me for my professional opinion, I'd say it's more likely to be coincidence or behavior we're misinterpreting. But if you're asking me what I believe," he trailed off. "What do you believe, David?" "I believe Shadow was unlike any wolf I've ever encountered," Dr. Carter said softly. "And I believe some things happen in this world that we don't have scientific explanations for yet." The pine cone was just the beginning. Every few days, through the remainder of December, Mike would find something new on his porch: a perfect feather from a blue jay, an unusually shaped stone polished smooth by water, a small shed antler from a young deer. Never anything large, never anything recently alive. Just small, beautiful objects that could only have been deliberately selected and placed. And always there were tracks, coming from the forest, approaching the house, retreating. Again before daylight. Shadow never allowed himself to be seen, never tried to make contact beyond these mysterious offerings. By New Year's, Mike had assembled quite a collection on his mantel. Martha noticed it immediately when she came to dinner on New Year's Eve, her eyes widening as Mike explained the origin of each item. "It's like he's thanking you," she said wonderingly, picking up the smooth stone and turning it in her hand. "Like he remembers everything you did for him. Or maybe he's checking on me," Mike suggested, "making sure I'm all right." Whatever the motivation, Shadow's periodic visits continued through January and into February. Never predictable, never on any discernible schedule, but regular enough that Mike found himself watching the tree line more often, wondering when the wolf might make one of his nighttime journeys to the farm. Then in late February, the coldest night of the winter brought an unexpected development that would change everything once again. Mike was awakened just after midnight by a sound he hadn't heard in 8 months, a faint scratching at his front door. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, the sound a memory rather than reality. Then it came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a soft whine that sent him bolting upright in bed. Moving quickly in the darkness, he pulled on his boots and coat over his pajamas and grabbed a flashlight. The scratching continued as he approached the door, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. When he opened the door, the beam of his flashlight illuminated something he'd never expected to see. Shadow, standing on the porch, but not alone. Beside him, barely visible against his black fur, was a small wolf pup, trembling violently in the bitter cold. Shadow's amber eyes met Mike's with that same inexplicable intelligence that had marked their relationship from the beginning. The message was unmistakable: helper. The pup couldn't have been more than 4 months old, far too young to be away from the pack in the dead of winter. Her thin body showed signs of malnutrition, and a matted patch of fur on her side suggested a recent injury. She pressed herself against Shadow's leg, clearly terrified, but trusting his guidance. For a long moment, Mike and Shadow regarded each other across the threshold, man and wolf, once again facing a moment of crisis that demanded a choice. Then Mike stepped back, opening the door wider. "Bring her in," he said softly. "Let's get her warm." Without hesitation, Shadow nudged the pup forward, guiding her into the warmth of the house he had once called home. As they crossed the threshold, together, Mike felt something shift in his understanding of the world, a broadening of possibilities, a deepening of mysteries too profound for words. Whatever was happening here went beyond science, beyond conventional wisdom about wild animals. This was something ancient and sacred, a bond that transcended the boundaries humans had drawn between their world and the wilderness. As he closed the door against the bitter night, Mike knew with absolute certainty that his life was about to change once again. Shadow had returned not for himself, but to save another, and in doing so, had brought the circle of compassion full circle. Part 14. The Ripple Effect. Mike worked through the night, drawing on all he had learned during Shadow's rehabilitation to stabilize the wolf pup. He named her Luna for the crescent moon that hung in the sky that night, a small sliver of light against the darkness, much like the spark of life he was fighting to preserve. Throughout those critical hours, Shadow remained a constant presence, watching every movement with alert attention, occasionally approaching to nuzzle the pup when her eyes fluttered open in fear or pain. His behavior defied everything Mike had been taught about wild wolves. This was not just a wolf who remembered human kindness. This was a wolf making a conscious choice to trust a human with the life of another. When dawn brought enough light to see clearly, Mike made the call he'd been both dreading and anticipating. "Shadow brought me a pup," he told Dr. Carter without preamble. "She's injured, malnourished. I need your help." The silence that followed was profound. When Dr. Carter finally spoke, his voice was hushed with disbelief. "He brought you a pup? You mean he's there now with you?" "Yes," Mike confirmed. "And before you ask, yes, I'm certain it's Shadow. Yes, I'm certain he brought her deliberately. And yes, he's showing every sign of wanting to stay until she's better." Dr. Carter arrived in record time despite the snow-covered roads, his vehicle loaded with medical supplies and monitoring equipment. The expression on his face when he entered Mike's living room to find Shadow calmly lying beside the makeshift bed where Luna rested was something Mike would never forget. Pure, scientific amazement tempered with profound wonder. "This changes everything," Dr. Carter whispered, setting down his bag without taking his eyes off the two wolves. "Everything we thought we knew about wolf cognition, about their capacity for cross-species relationship, about their decision-making processes." Luna's condition proved less dire than Mike had feared. The injury on her side was infected but superficial, likely from squeezing through barbed wire. Her malnutrition was severe but not yet life-threatening. With proper care, Dr. Carter assured Mike, she would recover fully. "The bigger question," he said as they watched Shadow gently nose Luna's sleeping form, "is what happened. Why does he have a pup this young without the rest of the pack? Where did she come from? And most importantly, why did he bring her to you?" These questions would find partial answers in the days that followed, as Officer Jenkins used Luna's DNA to identify her likely origin. The results told a story both tragic and hopeful. Luna was not from Shadow's pack, but from a neighboring family group that had been found shot dead by poachers 3 weeks earlier. Authorities had recovered 3 adult wolf bodies, but had speculated that at least one pup might have escaped the slaughter. Somehow Shadow had found this orphaned pup, perhaps through scent, perhaps through her distress calls, and had taken on the role of protector. Why he had brought her to Mike rather than attempting to integrate her into his own pack remained a mystery, though Dr. Carter had theories. Wolf packs can be reluctant to accept unrelated pups, especially in winter when resources are scarce, he explained. Shadow may have assessed the situation and made a calculated decision about where Luna would have the best chance of survival. The implications of such decision-making capacity in a wild wolf were staggering. As news of Shadow and Luna's story spread through the scientific community, Pine Hollow Farm became an unlikely center for research on wolf cognition and behavior. Researchers arrived from universities across the country, setting up observation blinds at a respectful distance from the house, documenting every aspect of Shadow's unprecedented behavior. Through it all, Mike maintained firm boundaries. No one was permitted to interfere with Shadow's freedom. The wolf came and went as he pleased, sometimes disappearing for days at a time before returning to check on Luna. No one was allowed to approach either wolf without Mike's supervision. And most importantly, no one was permitted to forget that these were wild animals making their own choices, not research subjects to be manipulated or controlled. As winter yielded to spring, Luna grew stronger. Her thin frame filled out, her dull coat regained its luster, and her initially fearful temperament blossomed into playful curiosity. Unlike Shadow, who had maintained a certain wild wariness even during his rehabilitation, Luna showed all the signs of a wolf pup imprinting on humans during her critical socialization period. She's not going to be releasable in the traditional sense, Dr. Carter acknowledged one evening as they watched Luna romping in the fenced area Mike had constructed behind the house. She's becoming habituated in ways Shadow never did. It was a concern that weighed heavily on Mike. Shadow had helped this pup survive, had brought her to safety, but in doing so, had potentially altered her ability to live fully as a wild wolf. The ethical questions were complex and without easy answers. The solution, when it emerged, came not from the scientists or wildlife officials, but from Shadow himself. As Luna's health improved, Shadow began taking her on increasingly longer excursions beyond the farm, first just to the edge of the woods, then deeper into the forest, always returning by nightfall. Mike would watch them go with an odd mixture of pride and concern, never fully easy until he heard the distinctive sound of wolf paws on the porch that signaled their return. Dr. Carter suggested placing a tracking collar on Luna to monitor these journeys, and Mike reluctantly agreed. The data revealed a fascinating pattern. Shadow was systematically introducing Luna to hunting grounds, water sources, and safe denning areas within a 10-mile radius of the farm, essentially teaching her the territory as an alpha wolf would teach a pup. He's creating a middle path for her, Dr. Carter realized. Neither fully wild nor fully dependent on humans, a life that encompasses both worlds just as his does now. By midsummer, the pattern had stabilized into something unprecedented. In documented wolf behavior, Shadow and Luna lived primarily in the wild, hunting and traveling throughout their territory, but regularly returned to Pine Hollow Farm every few days. Sometimes they stayed for hours, sometimes merely long enough to rest briefly on the porch. Sometimes they brought small gifts, interesting feathers, unusual stones, that Mike added to the growing collection on his mantle. The research team documented everything, publishing papers that challenged conventional understanding of wolf behavior and cognition. Shadow and Luna became known in wildlife circles as the boundary wolves, animals who moved fluidly between wild and human spaces while remaining fundamentally untamed. As word of their story spread beyond scientific journals into mainstream media, Pine Hollow Farm began receiving letters and emails from around the world. People shared stories of their own unexpected connections with wildlife, their beliefs about animal intelligence, their hopes for a world where humans and predators might find ways to coexist. One letter in particular moved Mike deeply. It came from a 10-year-old girl in Australia who had raised money for wolf conservation by selling homemade bracelets at her school. "I think Shadow brought Luna to you because he remembers love," she wrote in careful handwriting. My mom says animals only care about survival, but I think they remember kindness just like we do. I think Shadow wants to teach Luna that not all humans are bad, that some can be trusted. Maybe if more wolves knew that, and more humans knew, wolves could understand, everyone wouldn't be so afraid. Out of that letter grew an idea that would eventually transform Pine Hollow Farm into something Sarah would have loved. With Martha's encouragement and Dr. Carter's expertise, Mike established the Shadows Trust Wildlife Education Center, a small, carefully managed facility dedicated to teaching coexistence between humans and predators. School groups visited to learn about wolf behavior and ecology. Ranchers came to study non-lethal livestock protection methods. Wildlife photographers participated in ethical observation workshops. Throughout it all, the story of Shadow and Luna served as the foundation, a true account of what was possible when fear gave way to understanding. Shadow and Luna themselves remained wild, their appearances unpredictable and on their own terms. Some visitor groups were fortunate enough to glimpse them at the forest's edge. Others saw only the collection of gifts on the mantle and the photos documenting their extraordinary journey. But all left with a deeper appreciation for the intelligence and complexity of the creatures with whom we share the land. On a golden afternoon in late September, nearly 2 years after Shadow had first appeared on his porch with Luna, Mike sat on the farmhouse steps, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. The education center had closed for the day, the last. School bus departing down the long driveway, with children still chattering excitedly about everything they'd learned. The sound of movement at the forest edge drew his attention. Shadow emerged from the trees, his black coat gleaming in the slanting sunlight. Luna followed, no longer the scrawny pup of that desperate winter night, but a healthy young wolf in her prime. Behind them, more cautiously, came 2 more wolves, members of the Silver Ridge Pack who had gradually begun accompanying Shadow and Luna on their visits to the farm. Mike remained perfectly still as the small group approached. They stopped, at a respectful distance, regarding him with that particular wild alertness that no amount of familiarity had ever quite erased. Shadow stepped forward from the others, something held gently in his mouth. The wolf approached with deliberate dignity, stopping a few feet from the steps. Carefully, he placed his offering on the ground, a perfect pine cone, remarkably similar to that first gift he had brought so long ago. Mike felt tears well in his eyes as he understood the symmetry of the moment, the completion of a circle that had begun on a desperate winter night when a dying wolf had sought help from a grieving man. Both had been broken in their own ways. Both had found healing in the most unexpected of places. "Thank you," Mike said softly. Shadow held his gaze for a long moment, those amber eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. Then, with the fluid grace that had never ceased to take Mike's breath away, he turned and loped back to the waiting wolves. Together, the small pack disappeared into the gathering dusk, wild and free and somehow impossibly still connected. Mike picked up the pine cone, turning it over in his hands as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow, it would join the collection on the mantle, tangible proof of a story most people would never believe without seeing it with their own eyes. A story about boundaries crossed and respected, about intelligence that defied human expectations, about connections that transcended species. A story about a lonely wolf who brought gifts and the man whose tears flowed freely when he understood what those gifts truly meant. Not just objects carried in jaws designed for hunting, but offerings of trust from a wild heart. Reminders that in a world so often defined by what separates us, there are moments of grace where the boundaries fall away, revealing the simpler truth beneath. That compassion, once given, creates ripples that continue long after the initial act. That kindness, even to those unlike ourselves, returns in ways we could never anticipate. that sometimes the greatest gifts come to us not when we are grasping or demanding, but when we have opened our hands to let something go free. Mike looked once more toward the forest where Shadow had disappeared, his heart full with a peace he had never expected to find again after Sarah's death. "Be wild," he whispered to her. "The gathering darkness. Be free. And know you always have a home here whenever you choose to return." As years passed, the story of Shadow and Luna grew into something of a local legend around Evergreen. Children would beg their parents to take them to Shadow's Trust Wildlife Education Center, hoping for a glimpse of the famous wolves. Researchers continued to study the extraordinary relationship, publishing findings that gradually shifted scientific understanding of wolf cognition and emotional capacity. Mike's collection of gifts grew steadily. Each new item was photographed, catalogued, and displayed alongside information about the date it appeared and the weather conditions. What had begun as Shadow's solitary offerings expanded to include items brought by Luna as well, her selections distinctly different from her mentors. She favored colorful objects, particularly blue items, while Shadow continued his tradition of bringing perfectly formed, natural specimens. The most remarkable development came in the spring of the third year, when Luna appeared at the edge of the forest with a mate, a strong young male from the Silver Ridge pack that researchers identified from his markings as one of the yearlings that had occasionally accompanied Shadow on visits to the farm. 2 months later, Luna gave birth to 4 healthy pups in a den located within sight of Pine Hollow Farm, close enough for safety, far enough to maintain their wild nature. Shadow, now fully mature and showing the first touches of gray around, his muzzle took on the role of sentinel and teacher to the new generation. Mike would sometimes spot him sitting on a ridge overlooking both the den site and the farm, a silent guardian bridging 2 worlds. The pups grew quickly, learning from both their biological parents and from Shadow. By autumn, they were old enough to make their first visits to the farm, approaching with the perfect balance of caution and curiosity that Shadow had somehow taught Luna to maintain. They never fully habituated to humans. They remained wild in all the ways that mattered, but they carried forward the extraordinary legacy of trust that had begun on that desperate winter night. On cold evenings, Mike would sit on his porch, watching the stars emerge above the mountains and listening to the pack's howls echoing through the valley. The sound no longer carried the loneliness it once had. Now it spoke of connection, of family, of boundaries respected and transcended. "You were right, Sarah," he would sometimes say to the night air. "The line between wild and domestic isn't as clear as we pretend. And love does connect all living things." The education center flourished, expanding to include research facilities and a small veterinary clinic specializing in predator rehabilitation. Ranchers who had once shot wolves on sight now came to learn about coexistence strategies. Children who visited grew up to become wildlife biologists, conservation officers, and advocates for wilderness protection. Through it all, the gifts continued to appear. Pine cones and feathers, stones and shed antlers, each one a reminder of the extraordinary bond that had formed between species traditionally separated by fear and misunderstanding. Each one a testament to the capacity for memory, for gratitude, for connection that defied conventional wisdom about the emotional lives of wild creatures. In scientific circles, the gift-giving behavior became the subject of serious study. Researchers documented similar phenomena in other rehabilitated predators, a fox bringing berries to the wildlife rehabilitator who had saved it, a lynx depositing a perfectly preserved flower on the doorstep of the forester who had rescued its kittens from a forest fire. What had once been dismissed as coincidence or anthropomorphic wishful thinking gradually gained legitimacy as a recognized form of cross-species communication. When Mike found himself speaking at wildlife conservation conferences, Something he would never have imagined in his former quiet life. He always began with the same simple truth. I didn't save Shadow. We saved each other. On the 10th anniversary of that first desperate night when Shadow had collapsed on his porch, Mike organized a small private celebration at Pine Hollow Farm. Martha, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, sat beside him on the porch. Dr. Carter, whose research with Shadow and Luna had earned him international recognition, raised a glass in toast. Officer Jenkins, recently retired but still involved with the education center as a volunteer, smiled as he recounted how skeptical he had initially been about the whole endeavor as twilight settled over the mountains. Bringing with it the first stars of evening, movement at the forest edge caught their attention. The pack emerged from the trees. Shadow, his muzzle now fully grayed with age, but his bearing still proud. Luna and her mate, now established alphas. Their offspring, some already with mates and pups of their own. 12 wolves in total, moving with fluid grace across the open space between forest and farm. They stopped at a respectful distance, regarding the gathered humans with the calm alertness that characterized their unique relationship with Pine Hollow Farm. Shadow stepped forward, something carried gently in his mouth. With the dignity that had always marked his interactions, he placed his offering on the ground before sitting back on his haunches, amber eyes fixed on Mike. Mike approached slowly, mindful as always of maintaining the boundary between respectful connection and inappropriate familiarity. The object Shadow had brought was unlike any previous gift, a small piece of weathered wood, worn smooth by water and time. As Mike carefully picked it up, he realized it had been carved, likely by human hands many years ago. The simple shape of the heart was still visible in the aged wood, though the edges had been softened by the elements. Mike felt tears spring to his eyes as he understood the perfect symbolism of this gift, an object shaped by both human intention and wild forces, transformed by time into something that belonged fully to neither world and somehow to both, just like Shadow himself. Just like the extraordinary relationship they had built across the traditional boundaries of species. "Thank you," Mike said softly, the words carrying on the evening breeze. Shadow held his gaze for a long moment, those ageless amber eyes containing wisdom that transcended language. Then, with characteristic grace, he rose and turned back to his waiting pack. Together, they melted into the gathering darkness of the forest, wild and free, and connected in ways that continued to redefine what was possible between humans and the natural world. As Mike returned to the porch, the carved heart warm in his palm, Martha smiled at him through tears of her own. "Sarah would have loved this," she said softly, "all of it." Mike nodded, his throat too tight for words. He knew with absolute certainty that somewhere, somehow, Sarah did know, that her spirit lived on in every gift Shadow brought, in every child who left the education center with a new understanding of wolves, in every rancher who chose coexistence over conflict, in every boundary crossed with respect rather than fear. The story of Mike and Shadow had begun with blood on snow and the desperate fight for survival. It had grown into something far greater, a testament to the healing power of compassion, the unexpected ways kindness returns to us, and the profound connections possible when we recognize the dignity and intelligence of the wild creatures with whom we share this planet. As darkness settled fully over Pine Hollow Farm, the first howls rose from the forest, Shadow's distinctive voice leading the chorus, echoing across the valley and returning as if the mountains themselves were answering. Mike closed his eyes and listened, holding the carved heart against his chest, feeling the resonance of that wild song in his own body. This was the greatest gift of all, not the objects Shadow had brought over the years, but the reminder that even in our most lonely moments, we are connected. That kindness once offered creates ripples that continue long after the initial act. That sometimes the most profound healing comes from reaching across the boundaries that separate us, human from wild, to recognize the shared spark of life that animates us all. "Thank you, old friend," Mike whispered to the darkness, "for everything." The education center continued to grow in the years that followed, eventually becoming one of the most respected wildlife research facilities in North America. Scientists from around the world came to study what became known as the shadow effect, the capacity for wild animals to form selective, specific relationships with individual humans while maintaining their essential wildness. Luna's offspring established territories throughout the region, each maintaining the unique middle path their grandfather had pioneered, fully wild in their hunting and social behaviors, yet capable of discerning which humans could be approached and which should be avoided. The wolf population stabilized, conflicts with ranchers decreased dramatically, and the model of coexistence developed at Pine Hollow Farm began to spread to other regions facing similar challenges. Mike's collection of gifts eventually became a permanent exhibition at the National Museum of Natural History, drawing visitors from around the world to marvel at the tangible evidence of cross-species communication and memory. Children would press their faces against the glass, counting pine cones and feathers, stones and antlers, their eyes wide with wonder at the story of the lonely wolf who brought gifts. On a crisp autumn morning in his 75th year, Mike sat on his porch watching the sun rise over the mountains. His hair had gone fully white now, his face weathered by decades of outdoor life, but his eyes remained bright with the same quiet joy that had characterized him since Shadow first changed his life. Martha had passed peacefully the previous winter, leaving Mike as the last living witness to those first extraordinary days of Shadow's rehabilitation. Dr. Carter had retired to write his memoirs, his groundbreaking research having changed scientific understanding of predator cognition. Officer Jenkins had been gone for years now, though his grandson had followed in his footsteps, becoming a wildlife conservation officer with a special focus on wolf protection. Shadow himself had not been seen for nearly 5 years. At nearly 15 years old, an extraordinary age for a wild wolf, he had gradually decreased his visits to the farm, though his descendants continued the tradition of occasional appearances and gift-giving. Mike had made peace with the likelihood that his old friend had found his final resting place somewhere in the mountains he had roamed so proudly, dying as he had lived, wild and free. Yet on this particular morning, something called Mike to walk the forest path that Shadow had traveled so many times. His old legs protested, but some instinct stronger than physical discomfort urged him forward. The forest welcomed him with the familiar scents of pine and earth, the morning light filtering through branches in patterns of gold and shadow. The clearing appeared before him suddenly, a small, sun-dappled space he had never noticed before, though it couldn't have been. More than a mile from the farm, in the center lay a perfect circle of stones, the kind that could only have been deliberately arranged. And in the center of that circle, catching the morning light like a beacon, lay a pine cone. Mike approached slowly, his heart pounding with a certainty he couldn't explain. The circle of stones contained not just the pine cone, but representatives of every type of gift Shadow had ever brought. A blue jay feather, a smooth river stone, a small antler, a piece of colored glass worn smooth by water. A collection that could only have been gathered by one who remembered, who understood, who wanted to be remembered in turn. This was no random arrangement. This was a memorial, a message, a final gift from one who had crossed the ultimate boundary. Mike knelt beside the circle, tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. "I remember you too, old friend," he whispered. "I always will." As if in answer, a wolf's howl rose from somewhere deeper in the forest. Not Shadow's voice, but Perhaps one of his grandchildren or great-grandchildren, carrying forward his legacy in the wild places of the world. The sound echoed across the mountains, a reminder that some connections transcend time, transcend death, transcend the boundaries between species. Mike carefully collected one small stone from the circle, a keepsake to add to his personal collection, but left the rest undisturbed. Some memorials belonged to the wild places. Some stories were written not in books, but in the landscape itself, in the memories of creatures humans had once believed incapable of such depth of feeling. As he made his way back toward the farm, Mike felt a profound peace settle over him. The journey that had begun on that desperate winter night had come full circle, had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined when he first opened his door to a dying wolf. What had started as an act of compassion had grown into a legacy that would continue long after both he and Shadow had returned to the earth, a legacy of understanding, of coexistence, of boundaries crossed with respect rather than fear. Behind him, the morning sun continued to illuminate the circle of stones, a silent testament to the extraordinary bond between a lonely man and a wild wolf. A bond that had healed them both, had changed scientific understanding, had inspired countless others to look differently at the wild creatures with whom we share this planet. And somewhere in the forest depths, Shadow's descendants continued their unique path, wild and free, yet carrying forward the memory of kindness, the capacity for connection, the understanding that sometimes the greatest gifts come when we recognize the dignity and intelligence in beings unlike ourselves. The story would continue, written not in words, but in pine cones left on porches, in wolf pups raised to understand that not all humans were to be feared, in the growing movement toward coexistence rather than conflict, written in the ripples of compassion that expand outward from a single act of kindness, touching lives both human and wild, in ways that could never be fully measured but would never be forgotten. That was Shadow's final gift, not just to Mike, but to all who would come after. A reminder that in this world, so often defined by what separates us, there are moments of grace where the boundaries fall away, revealing the simpler truth beneath, that compassion heals, that kindness returns, that sometimes the most profound connections come when we open our hands and our hearts to what is wild and free. 100 years had passed since that fateful winter night when Shadow first appeared on Mike Thompson's porch. A century of change had transformed both landscape and society. Climate shifts had altered the Montana wilderness. Technological revolutions had reshaped human capabilities, and cultural evolutions had gradually rewritten humanity's relationship with the natural world. Yet through these transformations, the legacy of one man and one wolf continued to unfold in ways that transcended ordinary understanding. The Shadows Trust Wildlife Foundation had become a global institution, its approaches to human-wildlife coexistence implemented across continents. What had begun as a simple act of compassion had grown into a movement that was gradually healing the ancient rift between humans and the wild predators with whom they shared the earth. The centennial celebration had drawn visitors from around the world to Pine Hollow Farm. Scientists, conservationists, indigenous knowledge keepers, and ordinary people inspired by the extraordinary story of Shadow and Mike. Throughout the week-long event, lectures and workshops explored the scientific advancements prompted by the boundary wolves, while evening gatherings focused on the cultural and spiritual dimensions of their continuing relationship with the human community. On this final morning of the centennial, as dawn approached on the exact anniversary of Shadow's arrival, a small group gathered at Memorial Circle, the stone arrangement that had expanded over decades to include markers for generations of humans and wolves who had carried the legacy forward. Among those present was Thomas Thompson, Mike's great-great-great-nephew and the Foundation's current historian. At 40, he had devoted his life to preserving not just the scientific knowledge accumulated over a century of research, but the deeper wisdom embodied in the Boundary Wolves' ongoing relationship with Pine Hollow Farm. "The light is perfect," observed Dr. Amara Chen, the Foundation's Director of Cognitive Research and descendant of the Chen family that had been involved with the Boundary Wolves for 4 generations. "Just like in the historical images from 50 years ago." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of history in this moment. They had gathered before dawn, not just for the symbolism of the hour, but because satellite tracking had shown unusual movement among all 12 boundary packs, convergent paths that suggested another historic gathering might be imminent. The first rays of sunlight had just begun to touch the mountains when movement appeared at the forest edge. Wolves emerged from the trees, not in small groups, but in a coordinated procession that left the watching humans breathless with wonder. Thomas counted them as they appeared, 107 in total, representing every boundary pack across the expanded territory the Foundation now protected. They moved with deliberate grace, arranging themselves in concentric circles around Memorial Circle, their formation reflecting family connections and lineages that Foundation researchers had documented across the century. At their center stood a jet-black wolf with distinctive white markings on his chest, a mirror image of Shadow himself, though this was Midnight, his direct descendant through an unbroken line that researchers had tracked through genetic sampling across generations. Dr. Chen's team activated their advanced recording equipment, documenting every aspect of this historic gathering while maintaining respectful distance. Non-invasive technologies now allowed detailed observation without disturbing the wolves' natural behavior, a balance between scientific documentation and ethical engagement that honored both research needs and wildlife autonomy. With dignified purpose, Midnight approached the center of Memorial Circle. In his mouth, he carried something that caught the morning light, an object immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the Foundation's history. It was an old thermal blanket, weathered and faded, preserved behind glass in the Foundation's museum for decades until its mysterious disappearance just 1 month earlier. The same blanket Mike had wrapped around Shadow on that winter night, a century ago. With ceremonial precision, Midnight placed the blanket at the exact center of the stone circle. Then he stepped back, his amber eyes meeting Thomas's with an intelligence that still, after 100 years of study, defied complete scientific explanation. One by one, other wolves from the innermost circle came forward, each depositing items that formed a complex arrangement around the blanket. Pine cones, feathers, stones, and human-made objects spanning the century of their shared history. "They're creating a timeline," Amara whispered, recognizing the chronological precision in the arrangement, just like the patterns documented at previous anniversaries, but more extensive. For nearly an hour, the wolves continued their careful arrangement of objects, working with coordination that suggested not just instinctive behavior, but conscious collaboration toward a shared purpose. When the presentation was complete, Midnight returned to the center, sitting beside the thermal blanket that had begun their shared story 100 years earlier. Then, with timing that could not be coincidental, he lifted his head precisely as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, releasing a howl that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath their feet. One by one, the others joined, their voices blending into a symphony that echoed across the valley and returned from the mountains like an answer. The sound held for what felt like eternity, a communication that transcended species boundaries, that spoke of memory and continuity and connection in ways words could never capture. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the weight of this moment that bridged a century of shared history between humans and wolves who had found a way to recognize each other across the greatest divide. When the howling finally ceased, the wolves remained in their formation, watching the humans with that particular wild alertness that no amount of familiarity had ever erased. Then with fluid grace, they began to disperse, not all at once, but in family groups, moving back toward the surrounding forest with unhurried dignity. Only Midnight remained, his attention still focused on the watching humans, as if waiting to ensure his message had been received. For several moments, he held Thomas's gaze specifically, a connection that seemed to transcend the biological differences between them and reach toward something more essential, a recognition of kinship not in form, but in spirit. Then, Midnight, too, turned toward the forest. At the tree line he paused, looking back once in a gesture that echoed across 100 years to Shadow's own farewell on the day of his release. With that final acknowledgement, he disappeared into the shadows beneath the pines, wild and free and connected all at once. As the research team moved forward to document the extraordinary collection of objects, Thomas remained where he was, his heart full with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Beyond the scientific significance, beyond the cognitive abilities demonstrated, lay a truth that transcended analysis, a living testament to what becomes possible when fear gives way to understanding, when difference becomes doorway rather than barrier. The boundary wolves had never been domesticated in any traditional sense. They remained fully wild, hunting, establishing territories, maintaining complex social structures. Yet they had also chosen to maintain connection with the human community. At Pine Hollow Farm, creating a unique middle path that honored both their wild nature and their shared history with those who had chosen compassion over fear a century earlier. Later that day, as the centennial celebration continued with presentations and discussions of what they had witnessed that morning, Thomas slipped away, drawn back to Memorial Circle by a need to experience the sight alone. The research team had carefully documented each object in the wolves' presentation, creating detailed, three-dimensional records before temporarily removing the collection for preservation and study. The circle stood empty now in the afternoon light, the smooth river stones that marked its boundary gleaming in the sun. Thomas settled on the bench at its edge, opening the leather-bound journal he carried, a replica of Mike's original field notebook containing transcriptions of his observations during those first critical days of Shadow's rehabilitation. Today, I chose kindness over fear, Thomas read aloud, his voice carrying on the mountain breeze. I don't know if this wolf will survive the night. I don't know what consequences will come from breaking every rule in the handbook. I only know that when I looked into his eyes, I saw something that transcended the boundary between human and wild, a plea for help that struck straight to my soul. Whatever happens next, I will not regret this choice. A century later, the consequences of that choice had expanded beyond anything Mike could have imagined that night. A multi-generational relationship between humans and wolves that had transformed scientific understanding, conservation practices, and cultural perceptions across the globe. The boundary wolves had become living proof of capabilities once thought impossible in non-human species, demonstrating memory that spanned generations, coordination across multiple family groups, symbolic communication that suggested awareness of historical context and significance. More profoundly, they had shown a capacity for relationship that honored boundaries while transcending them, that maintained wildness while creating connection, that passed cultural knowledge from one generation to the next, through teaching rather than mere imitation. As Thomas sat reflecting on this extraordinary legacy, movement at the forest edge caught his attention. A wolf had emerged from the trees, not Midnight or any of the wolves from the morning gathering, but a younger female with unusual silver-grey markings. She carried nothing, made no display or presentation. She simply stood watching him with calm attention, her presence both acknowledgement and invitation. Thomas remained still, respecting the distance between them, while recognizing the connection that bridged it. For several minutes, they regarded each other across the clearing. The human historian and the wolf, both carriers of a legacy neither had created, but both were committed to preserving. Then the wolf did something Thomas had seen only in historical footage preserved from decades earlier. She lowered her head in what appeared to be a deliberate gesture of acknowledgement, held the position for several seconds, then raised it again to meet his gaze. The movement was too precise, too measured to be coincidental. It carried the unmistakable quality of intentional communication across the species boundary. Responding to this ancient gesture that somehow bridged the gap between their worlds, Thomas inclined his own head slightly, maintaining eye contact. "I see you," he said softly. "I recognize you." The wolf held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and moved with fluid grace toward the forest edge. At the tree line, she paused, looking back once as if to ensure her message had been received. Then, with a flick of her tail, she disappeared into the afternoon shadows beneath the pines. Thomas sat motionless, his journal open in his hands, his heart full with a certainty that transcended scientific explanation. Whatever happened in the centuries to come, whatever challenges faced both wolves and humans in a world of continuing change, this connection would endure as long as there were those on both sides willing to remember, to recognize, to reach across the boundary with respect rather than fear. As evening settled over Pine Hollow Farm, the centennial celebration culminated in a gathering at the main compound. Representatives from conservation organizations, scientific institutions, indigenous communities, and governments from around the world came together to honor the legacy of Shadow and Mike and to commit to carrying their wisdom forward into the next century. What began with one wolf and one man has become a movement that spans continents, said Dr. Amara Chen in her closing address. The boundary wolves have taught us that intelligence, memory, emotional capacity, and symbolic thinking exist throughout. The living world informs both similar to and different from human experience. They have shown us that relationships can honor both wildness and connection, both difference and commonality. Most profoundly, they have demonstrated that boundaries need not be barriers, that with respect and understanding, they can become thresholds across which we meet each other in all our magnificent diversity. As darkness fell completely, the celebration concluded with a candlelight procession to Memorial Circle, where each participant placed a small stone as a symbol of commitment to continuing the work of bridging worlds with compassion rather than fear. Together, they formed a second circle outside the original arrangement of river stones, 100 new markers for the 100 years to come. Thomas stood somewhat apart, watching the procession with a sense of both fulfillment and responsibility. The foundation he helped lead faced challenges his great-great-great-uncle could never have imagined. Climate disruptions that threatened wolf habitats, technological developments that required constant adaptation of research methods, cultural shifts that both supported and challenged their mission of promoting coexistence. Yet through all these changes, the core truth that Mike and Shadow had discovered remained constant. That when we reach across boundaries with respect and compassion, we discover not just the other, but ourselves, reflected back in eyes both familiar and wild, both different and the same. As the last participants departed back toward the foundation buildings, Thomas remained at Memorial Circle, watching the stars emerge above the eastern mountains. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing, the boundary wolves were moving through their territories, hunting, playing, teaching their young the complex ways of both wolf society and their unique relationship with the human world that bordered their own. As if confirming this thought, a chorus of howls rose from the forest depths, not mournful but celebratory, not distant but connected, a wild symphony that echoed across the valley and returned from the mountains like an answer. Thomas stood listening until the last notes faded into silence, his heart full with the knowledge that some connections, once formed, continue to resonate across time and space and species, their meaning deepening with each new generation that carries them forward into the future. Returning to the foundation buildings, he found most of the celebration attendees had departed for their lodgings, leaving the main compound quiet under the starlight. In his office, Thomas opened the climate-controlled cabinet where the thermal blanket Midnight had brought that morning was now stored after careful documentation. Though weathered by time and elements, its significance remained undiminished, a physical link to that first moment of connection between Shadow and Mike, a testimony to memory preserved and transmitted across a century of wolf generations. How the blanket had disappeared from its museum display, how it had come into Midnight's possession, how the boundary wolves coordinated their centennial gathering with such precise timing. These were questions that might never find complete answers. After 100 years of research, the wolves still maintained their mysteries alongside their connections, their wildness, alongside their remarkable capacity for relationship across species boundaries. And perhaps that was as it should be, Thomas reflected, as he carefully closed the cabinet. True relationship honored the sovereignty of the other, respected the boundary even as it created bridges across it, recognized that some knowledge was meant to be shared and some belonged to each distinct world. Thomas glanced at the clock, realizing how late the hour had grown. As he prepared to leave, his gaze fell on a small object sitting precisely in the center of his desk. A perfect pine cone that had not been there when he left his office that morning. Through the open window behind his desk, a cool night breeze carried the scent of the surrounding forest, a reminder that the boundary between worlds remained permeable in ways that continued to defy explanation. Smiling, Thomas placed the pine cone carefully in the collection drawer where he kept similar gifts that had appeared throughout his years at the foundation. Tomorrow would bring new research questions, new observations, new attempts to understand the boundary wolves' extraordinary capabilities through the lens of science. But tonight was for honoring the mystery itself, the inexplicable wonder of connection that had begun with a dying wolf and a compassionate man, and had somehow expanded beyond their individual lives to influence generations of both wolves and humans who came after them. Outside, beneath the vast Montana sky, where stars had witnessed the entire human journey and would witness whatever came after, the boundary wolves continued their ancient ways, wild and free, separate and connected, mysterious and known. And in their movement through the darkness, in their remembrance across generations, in their gifts brought to the threshold between worlds, they carried forward the living legacy of Shadow and Mike. That compassion, once given, creates ripples that continue long after the initial act. That kindness, even to those unlike ourselves, returns in ways we could never anticipate, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come not when we are grasping or demanding, but when we have opened our hands to let something go free. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.